I know that you're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change.
We got another explosion on the tower, 1013, 1013, we got a second tower down.
There are many, many peculiar things that happened on September 11th, 2001. And I became uncomfortably aware of these over the years. I didn't take a lot of time to sit down and put them all together, but I filed them away and finally was challenged somewhere in late 2005 by an American political dissident to look into this more seriously, this business of 9/11. So I did. I began reading about it more carefully. Let's begin with the collapse of the towers. When that south tower fell down 56 minutes after it was hit, as I began reading, I realized that in a sense those towers didn't fall down. If they had fallen down in any of the senses that we're familiar with, it wouldn't have seemed so peculiar. What they did, however, was disintegrate. Looking again at that south tower, what happens around 9:59, 56 minutes after it struck? First of all, the steel frame of the building gives way suddenly, symmetrically, and completely.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way!
So that one moment you've got this building supported by 287 robust steel columns, including 47 very strong core columns in the core of the building. And 15 seconds later, all that steel is lying on the ground, apparently cut up into pieces. Now that's strange. But while that's happening, another process is also taking place, and that is that the rest of the building, the non-steel structure part of the building, is being pulverized.
I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
I'm not just falling to the ground. Office furniture, glass, computers, not to mention all these bodies. Over 1,000 human beings have never been identified. Their remains have never been discovered in those buildings. So all of this is being turned into fine gravel and even finer powder. And this isn't happening when the building hits the ground. We would expect that. It's 110 stories, it's going to hit the ground very hard. But it's happening starting at the very top of the building. Already this pulverization is happening. And great streams of this gravel and powder can be seen coming from the tower all the way down as it disintegrates. So that the building, in any recognizable sense, never does hit the ground. It's gone long before that. The building descends to the ground as a cloud, in effect, of this pulverized material, which then rushes and billows down all the streets near where the trade centers were, engulfing people. We think of people as breathing in the smoke or breathing in the chemical fumes. They were breathing in the buildings. Okay, that's what they breathed in. And the only things that weren't pulverized were the steel, which I mentioned separately, and a good deal of paper, which was mysteriously blown out of the buildings and floated all over the places. Now, when we look at this, we're bound to ask, if we've got any kind of curiosity, is this the way buildings normally fall down? Is this the way a steel skyscraper typically comes to the Earth? We rapidly find, no, this is unique. Well, what's the closest thing to this in history that we can find? And it turns out to be controlled demolition. It turns out that it's actually quite difficult to bring down a huge building like this symmetrically into its own basement. Not falling here, not falling there, no partial collapses or asymmetrical collapses, just coming down, boom, at almost free fall speed. It takes a lot of skill. It takes a lot of planning, planting all these explosives here and there. And so it seemed to me that any intelligent person thinking about this would say, well, as we line up our hypotheses in a little row to later be checked out through research, one of the hypotheses for why and how these buildings came down would have to be that they were brought down by explosives and that this was a planned thing. In other words, some kind of controlled demolition. Now, I'm not arguing at this point that it should be obvious to all of us that it was controlled demolition. I'm making a much more modest, completely rational claim that as we investigate such collapses, one of the hypotheses we would look at would be planted explosives. It would be very peculiar to exclude that and push that from the table. Well, how distressing then when I discovered that the 9/11 Commission's report, which came out in 2004, didn't even entertain the idea. It's not in there, it's not mentioned, they didn't look into it. They essentially started there, as far as I can tell, the Commission accepted the FBI's finding that there were 19 Arab hijackers, that they had rammed their planes in the buildings, and the buildings came down because of plane impact, burning jet fuel, and that's it, folks. So, in a very strange way, the Commission had accepted the who did it and how they did it. Then the NIST report comes out in 2005. This is the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the United States. And again, they don't seriously consider controlled demolition. It's not even mentioned in the first draft of the final report. Because of complaints from people, they then throw in a couple of token sentences in the final version saying, we found no evidence of controlled demolition. Well, folks, if you don't look, you don't find. And there's no indication that they seriously looked at this hypothesis. Once again, this group of scientists seem to have accepted at the outset that they knew who did it and they knew how they did it, that their job was simply to fill in the blanks. Their explanation is extremely unconvincing.
We got another explosion on a tower, 1013, 1013, we got a second tower down. What's involved in the secondary explosion at Tower 1?
There's nothing kooky or far out or exotic or irrational about wanting to include a controlled demolition hypothesis in our group of hypotheses as we begin trying to figure out why these buildings disintegrated. Thomas von Essen, then the fire commissioner for the city of New York, decided to have the firefighters and EMT people who were on the scene on the day, to have them interviewed and to allow them a fair bit of scope in saying what they did and what happened to them on that day. He was afraid that memories would be distorted over time and that people would actually forget the crucial impressions and ideas they had on that day. And I think it was extremely prophetic of him to set up these interviews. He had about 503 people interviewed quite soon after the event. These interviews ranged from about a month after the event, early to mid-October 2001, into 2002. So they're pretty close to the event. Altogether, they comprise about 12,000 pages. It's a lot of material. And remember, these are all people who were present on the scene. Now, I was stunned when I found out in February of 2006 that this material existed and that it was largely being ignored by people. Imagine you have a massive crime and you ignore the eyewitnesses who were there. It's just a stunning notion.